At 11:32 in the morning on December 20th, 1943, at an altitude of 27,000 feet over northern Germany, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown tightened his grip on the control column of his B-17 Flying Fortress and watched the sky in front of him erupt. Below his formation, more than 200 German anti-aircraft guns opened fire at once. Black bursts of flak climbed upward, precise and disciplined, tearing holes in the thin air where the American bombers were flying in straight, predictable lines. Brown was 21 years old. He had completed exactly 0 combat missions. This was his first time over enemy territory. His aircraft was a B-17F named Ye Old Pub. It carried 10 men and nearly 6,000 pounds of bombs. The target that morning was a Focke-Wulf 190 fighter aircraft factory on the outskirts of Bremen, a critical link in Germany's air defense network. The mission briefing earlier that day had been short and restrained. Intelligence officers had warned the crews that resistance would be heavy. They had mentioned fighters. They had mentioned flak. They had not explained what heavy really meant. Brown's bomber was assigned a position on the far edge of the formation. Among the men of the 379th Bombardment Group, that position had a name. They called it Purple Heart Corner. It was the most dangerous place in the sky. From there, German fighters could attack without facing overlapping defensive fire from neighboring bombers. It was where aircraft were hit first. It was where crews were wounded first. It was where new crews were often placed. Charlie Brown's crew was the newest of all. There was no discussion about the assignment. Orders were orders. The formation had to be filled, and someone had to fly the edge. The logic was bureaucratic, not personal. But in the air, logic offered no protection. As the formation approached Bremen, the flak intensified. The bursts grew thicker, closer, more accurate. A 20-millimeter shell detonated directly in front of Ye Old Pub's nose. The plexiglass shattered instantly, exploding inward. The temperature outside was 60 degrees below zero. Wind screamed through the open cockpit at more than 150 miles per hour. Frost formed on exposed skin within seconds. Almost immediately, the number 2 engine failed. Moments later, the number 4 engine began to overspeed, threatening catastrophic failure. Brown throttled it back, sacrificing power to keep it from tearing itself apart. The bomber slowed. The rest of the formation did not. One by one, the other B-17s pulled ahead, their contrails stretching away like lifelines being cut. Within seconds, Ye Old Pub was alone. That isolation was visible from miles away. German fighter pilots did not need radios to recognize it. A single, crippled bomber, drifting behind the formation, was an invitation. From above and behind, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s began to descend. This was the moment every bomber crew feared, the moment the briefing never truly prepared them for. Charlie Brown had trained for years, memorizing procedures, checklists, and emergency drills. But training assumed systems still worked. Training assumed help was nearby. At 27,000 feet over Germany, in Purple Heart Corner, with flak bursting and fighters closing in, those assumptions no longer applied. For Charlie Brown and the men of Ye Old Pub, the mission had not even reached its target, and already everything was going wrong. The fighters came fast. From Charlie Brown's position in the cockpit, they appeared first as dark shapes cutting through the sunlight, dropping from above and behind with practiced precision. 12, maybe 15 of them. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. Moving not like machines, but like predators that had done this many times before. They did not rush. They circled. They waited for angles. They knew the bomber was wounded. The first passes came from the rear. Cannon shells tore through the tail section. Metal screamed as rounds punched into the fuselage. Inside the aircraft, warning lights flared and died. The intercom filled with shouted reports, then static. The oxygen system ruptured. Pressure dropped instantly. Masks snapped into place, but the flow was uneven. Somewhere in the aircraft, hydraulic fluid sprayed into the freezing air and crystallized on contact. The temperature inside the bomber fell rapidly. At 27,000 feet, it was 60 degrees below zero outside. With the nose plexiglass gone, that cold poured straight into the cockpit. The wind roared through the aircraft at more than 150 miles per hour, ripping loose maps and papers from their clips and plastering them against the walls. Skin burned, then went numb. Breath turned to frost. The second attack came from below. A burst of cannon fire ripped through the center section. The No. 3 engine took multiple hits and dropped to half power. The bomber lurched violently, yawing to the left. Charlie Brown fought the controls, his gloved hands stiffening as the cold crept deeper into his fingers. The aircraft was no longer flying straight. It was staggering forward, heavy and slow, like something already dying. The fighters kept coming. They attacked in turns, one after another, never staying long enough to be hit cleanly. Brown's gunners fired when they could, but the cold was winning. The oil in the machine guns thickened, then froze. One by one, the guns fell silent. Out of 11 mounted .50 caliber machine guns, only 3 were still able to fire, and even those jammed intermittently. Then the tail gun went quiet. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode was in the rear compartment when a 20mm shell struck directly through his position. He was killed instantly. There was no call on the intercom, no last words. Just silence from the back of the aircraft, where one of the crew had been moments before. Inside the fuselage, men were bleeding. Shrapnel tore through flesh and flight gear. Brown felt a sharp impact in his right shoulder as a fragment cut through his jacket and lodged deep in the muscle. Pain flared, then dulled as the cold tightened its grip. Other crew members reported wounds to legs, arms, faces. Blood froze almost as soon as it spilled, turning dark and brittle against the aluminum skin. The electrical system failed next. Lights flickered, then went out. Instruments went dead or froze in place. The bomber was now flying blind, deaf, and wounded, held together by momentum and instinct. Without power, the heated wiring in the crew's flight suits stopped working. Frostbite began to set in. Fingers lost feeling. Toes went numb. Men stomped their feet and clenched their hands, trying to force blood back into frozen limbs. The oxygen supply was almost gone. At that altitude, without oxygen, the human brain cannot function. Vision narrows. Thought slows. Judgment fades. Charlie Brown felt the edges of the world closing in. His sight tunneled. The roar of the engines grew distant, like it was happening somewhere else. Beside him, his co-pilot, Spencer Luke, slumped forward, unconscious, his mask hanging uselessly against his chest. The bomber took another hit. Hydraulic pressure dropped to 0. Control surfaces responded sluggishly, then barely at all. Brown was no longer flying the aircraft so much as persuading it to stay level. The Germans pressed in closer now, sensing the end. Cannon fire shredded what remained of the tail section. Holes opened in the fuselage, large enough to see straight through the aircraft from side to side. Inside those holes, the fighters could see everything. They could see wounded men dragging themselves across the floor, They could see blood streaked along the walls. They could see a bomber crew that was no longer fighting, only surviving. But the attacks did not stop. The oxygen finally ran out. Charlie Brown's hands slipped on the controls. His thoughts fragmented. He tried to speak, but the words never formed. The last thing he felt was the aircraft beginning to tip forward as gravity took over. The B-17 went into a dive. It dropped from 27,000 feet, nose down, accelerating rapidly. Airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour. The airframe shook violently as the bomber plunged through denser air. Any moment, the wings could shear off under the stress. Any moment, the aircraft could break apart completely. Inside the cockpit, there was no control. Charlie Brown was unconscious. His co-pilot was unconscious. The crew was scattered through the freezing fuselage, some barely aware they were falling. The fighters pulled away, convinced the bomber was finished. No aircraft could survive that kind of damage and that kind of dive. The ground rushed upward. Trees and fields blurred together. At roughly 1,000 feet above the ground, something changed. The thicker air carried enough oxygen to revive the pilot. Charlie Brown's eyes opened. His vision snapped back into focus just long enough for him to understand what was happening. They were about to die. With what strength he had left, Brown grabbed the controls and pulled back. Every muscle in his arms and shoulders burned as he fought the weight of the aircraft. The bomber shuddered. The dive slowed. The nose came up. At the last possible moment, the B-17 leveled out just above the treetops of northern Germany. It was flying again. Barely. Charlie Brown took in the cockpit around him. Blood coated the controls. The windshield was gone. Cold air tore at his face. His shoulder throbbed where the metal fragment was embedded. Behind him, men were wounded, freezing, and exhausted. One of them was dead. The bomber had survived flak, fighters, decompression, and a near-fatal dive. But nothing about its condition suggested it could survive what came next. For ye old pub, the destruction was not over. It had only paused. The sudden silence inside Charlie Brown's head was the first thing he noticed. Moments earlier, the world had been collapsing into darkness. Now it rushed back all at once. Air filled his lungs. His vision cleared just enough for him to see the altimeter spinning down through numbers no bomber crew ever expected to see while still alive. They were no longer at 27,000 feet. They were plunging toward the earth. The reason he was conscious at all was simple and terrifying. At this lower altitude, there was enough oxygen to wake him. Not enough to save them. Just enough to let him understand what was about to happen. The ground was impossibly close. Brown did not think in words. There was no time for fear, no time for panic. His hands found the control column and pulled back with everything his frozen arms could give. Pain shot through his shoulder where the metal fragment was lodged, but the pain did not matter. Nothing mattered except stopping the dive. The B-17 answered slowly, reluctantly. The airframe screamed as stress rippled through it. The wings flexed under loads they were never meant to carry. For a moment, it felt as if the aircraft might simply tear itself apart in protest. Then, the nose came up. The dive flattened into a desperate, low-altitude run just above the tops of trees. Branches blurred beneath the cockpit. Fields flashed by in streaks of brown and green. The bomber was no longer a fortress in the sky. It was a wounded machine skimming the earth, alive only because it had not yet had time to die. Charlie Brown forced his breathing to slow. Each breath burned his lungs. Cold air tore through the open cockpit, numbing his face and hands. He glanced at the instruments that still worked. Most of them did not. The electrical system was gone. The hydraulic system was gone. 3 engines were damaged. 1 was dead. The bomber was being held together by momentum, gravity, and a pilot who refused to let go. Brown looked around the cockpit. Blood was everywhere. It streaked the floor, the walls, the shattered window frames. His co-pilot, Spencer Luke, was slumped in his seat, still unconscious, his face pale beneath the oxygen mask that no longer delivered oxygen. Brown reached over and shook him, hard. Luke groaned faintly, but did not wake. Behind the cockpit, the rest of the aircraft was in no better condition. Men lay where they had fallen, clutching wounds, pressing frozen hands against torn flesh. The intercom crackled with weak voices and long stretches of silence. Somewhere in the tail, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode's body remained where it had been hit. There was no way to move him. There was no time to acknowledge what had been lost. The bomber crossed over a German fighter airfield. Brown did not know it at the time. He was too focused on keeping the aircraft from slamming into the ground. But below them, on the frozen earth, Luftwaffe fighters sat lined up on concrete, fuel trucks parked beside them, ground crews frozen in mid-motion as they looked up in disbelief. An American B-17, shredded and bleeding, flew past at barely 100 feet. Charlie Brown did not see the men on the ground. He saw only the narrow ribbon of sky ahead and the trembling wings on either side of him. Every vibration felt final. Every second felt borrowed. He expected another burst of flak at any moment, another attack from fighters he could no longer see. But none came. For the first time since the attack began, there was a pause. The bomber limped onward, low and exposed, moving deeper into enemy territory instead of away from it. Brown knew what that meant, even if he did not say it aloud. At this altitude and this speed, they were flying directly over Germany's heart. More airfields, more guns, more chances to be finished by someone who would not hesitate. He glanced at the compass, then at the horizon. West was still far away. The North Sea was still beyond that. England might as well have been on another planet. Charlie Brown understood the truth with a clarity that cut through exhaustion and pain. They had survived the impossible. They had pulled back from the edge of destruction. Now came the harder question. Why were they still alive? And what were they supposed to do next? Franz Stigler saw the bomber before he heard it. It was flying far too low for an American heavy bomber, skimming the landscape like an aircraft that had lost its place in the sky. Its wings were scarred, its fuselage torn open, its formation long gone. To Stigler's trained eye, it did not look like a threat. It looked like something already defeated. Stigler was 28 years old. By December of 1943, he was one of the most experienced fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe. He had flown 487 combat missions. He had been shot down 17 times. 6 times he had bailed out of burning aircraft. 11 times he had crash-landed damaged planes. Survival, for him, was not luck. It was routine. That morning, he had already shot down 2 American bombers. One more would complete the requirement for the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. It was not just a medal. It was recognition, prestige, proof that sacrifice meant something. Stigler's younger brother, August, had been a pilot too. In 1940, August had died when his Junkers 88 crashed during a night bombing mission over England. The Knight's Cross would not bring him back, but it would honor his memory. It would say that the Stigler family had given everything to the war. When the call came in about a crippled B-17 flying low over northern Germany, Stigler did not hesitate. He climbed into his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 and took off immediately. The engine was not in perfect condition. Earlier that day, a .50 caliber round had lodged in his radiator. The engine risked overheating, but the risk was acceptable. The target was too easy. He climbed, then leveled out behind the American bomber. From the classic attack position, slightly above and behind the tail, Stigler had a perfect shot. His finger rested on the trigger. One squeeze would send 20mm cannon shells through the bomber's fuselage. One squeeze would finish it. The Knight's Cross would be his. But as he closed the distance, something felt wrong. The bomber did not fire back. Stigler expected at least sporadic defensive fire, even from a damaged aircraft. Instead, there was nothing. No tracers, no flashes, just silence. He eased closer, curiosity replacing urgency. And what he saw through the holes torn in the bomber's skin made him pull back slightly on the throttle. Inside the aircraft, men were not fighting. They were bleeding. Through the shattered fuselage, Stigler could see wounded crew members struggling to help each other. One man's face was covered in blood. Another's leg was torn open, the wound gaping and dark. In the tail section, the gun position was destroyed. The body of the tail gunner slumped lifelessly over his weapon, blood frozen into long red streaks by the cold air rushing through the aircraft. These were not enemies defending themselves. They were survivors trying not to die. Stigler flew closer, almost alongside the bomber now. He could see the pilot and co-pilot through the shattered cockpit window, hands tight on the controls, faces pale with exhaustion and fear. They were not looking for a fight. They were looking for a way out. In that moment, the war shifted for Franz Stigler. He remembered another desert, years earlier, flying over North Africa. He remembered the words of his commanding officer, Gustav Rödel, spoken to young pilots before their first missions. Rödel had been clear. If he ever heard of one of his men shooting at a pilot in a parachute, he would shoot that pilot himself. A man who could not fight back was not a combatant. Killing him was not combat. It was murder. The bomber beside Stigler was not hanging from parachutes, but it might as well have been. They had no working guns. They had no speed. They had no protection. Shooting them down would not be a victory. It would be an execution. Stigler felt the weight of the rosary beads in his flight jacket pocket. His mother had wanted him to become a priest. He had chosen the sky instead, but he had never abandoned his faith. And his faith did not leave room for killing defenseless men. His finger tightened on the trigger. If he fired, he would be a hero. The Knight's Cross would follow. His brother's death would be honored. No one would question the decision. This was war. This was duty. If he did not fire, the consequences were unthinkable. Allowing an enemy aircraft to escape was treason. Escorting it was worse. Court-martial would be swift. Punishment could be death by firing squad. There would be no appeal, no explanation, no chance to justify why mercy had mattered more than orders. Stigler looked again at the bomber's crew. He saw young faces. He saw fear, pain, and determination. He saw men who would die if he made a single movement with his finger. Slowly, deliberately, Franz Stigler lifted his hand away from the trigger. He made his decision. He would not shoot. The Knight's Cross would remain out of reach. His brother's name would go unspoken in official records. The war would continue without acknowledging what he was about to do. but he would not be responsible for killing men who could not fight back. The Messerschmitt slid closer, wingtip nearly level with the bomber's fuselage. Stigler raised his hand inside the cockpit and looked toward the American pilot. He did not know the man's name. He did not know if the gesture would be understood, but he knew this moment would define him far more than any medal ever could. For the first time in years of combat, Franz Stigler was not thinking about victory. He was thinking about what kind of man he would be when the war was over. Franz Stigler stayed alongside the bomber, close enough to see the American pilot's eyes through the shattered cockpit window. The young man was staring back at him, rigid with fear, waiting for the moment when the German fighter would finally fire. Stigler raised his hand and pointed downward. He was trying to tell the American to land. Below them were German airfields, runways long enough to take a heavy bomber. If the crew surrendered now, they would live. Medical treatment would follow. Prisoner of war camps were harsh, but they were not graves. Charlie Brown did not understand. From Brown's perspective, the gesture meant only one thing: go down, crash, die. He shook his head violently and tightened his grip on the controls. There would be no surrender. If they were going to die, they would die trying to reach home. Stigler tried again. This time, he pointed north, towards Sweden, neutral territory. If the bomber could reach it, the crew would be interned, but alive. Doctors would be waiting. The war would be over for them. Brown still did not understand. The B-17 kept flying west. Stigler felt the situation slipping away. Sparing the bomber was not enough. Mercy without action was meaningless. The American aircraft was flying deeper into Germany, toward more airfields, more radar stations, more flak batteries. Someone else would see it. Someone else would shoot it down without hesitation. If Stigler did nothing, the crew would die anyway. He realized there was only one option left, and it was the most dangerous one imaginable. Franz Stigler would escort the enemy bomber to safety. In Nazi Germany, this was not a gray area. A pilot who allowed an enemy aircraft to escape could be court-martialed for treason. A pilot who actively protected it could be executed. There would be no trial in the conventional sense, no defense, no explanation. The sentence could be carried out quietly and quickly. Stigler knew this. He also knew that once he committed to this course, there would be no turning back. He eased his Messerschmitt Bf 109 closer, sliding into formation alongside the left wing of the B-17. Not behind it, not above it, beside it. So close that the two aircraft were separated by only a few feet of frozen air. So close that from the ground, their silhouettes would blur together. Inside the bomber, Charlie Brown watched in disbelief. He ordered his top turret gunner, Bertram Calkins, to aim at the German fighter, but not fire. The crew was too exhausted, too confused to understand what was happening. Was this a trick? Was the German calling in reinforcements? Was this some cruel game? The German fighter stayed with them. Mile after mile passed beneath their wings. Farmland, roads, villages, columns of military vehicles moving below. At any moment, someone could look up and recognize the impossible sight in the sky. A German fighter escorting an American bomber. At any moment, another Luftwaffe pilot could appear and demand an explanation. None did. Stigler held his position with absolute precision. He was daring the German anti-aircraft gunners to fire. If they shot at the bomber, they would hit him as well. From below, the shape of the Messerschmitt was unmistakable. German gunners were trained to recognize it instantly. Captured B-17s were sometimes flown by the Luftwaffe for training and special missions. If ground crews saw a German fighter flying in tight formation with a bomber, they might assume this was one of their own aircraft. They might hesitate. Hesitation was all Stigler needed. The coastline appeared ahead. This was the most dangerous stretch of all. The Atlantic Wall guarded the coast of occupied Europe with radar stations, observer posts, and heavy flak batteries. Every aircraft crossing the shoreline was tracked. Every unidentified contact was treated as hostile. An American bomber flying low and slow toward the North Sea should have been obliterated within seconds. Stigler did not break formation. He flew even closer now, his wingtip nearly brushing the bomber's fuselage. If the gunners fired, they would kill a German pilot as well. He was placing his own life between the guns and the Americans he had decided to save. The radar stations tracked two aircraft flying together. They did not fire. The flak batteries watched the silhouettes pass overhead. They did not fire. The bomber crossed the beach and headed out over the gray water of the North Sea. Against all odds, it had worked. Franz Stigler had escorted an enemy bomber through the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. But he could not go any farther. His fuel was running low. The damaged radiator was still leaking. If he followed the bomber into British airspace, he would be captured and spend the rest of the war in a prison camp, if he survived at all. He had to turn back now, or he would never return to Germany. Stigler eased his fighter slightly ahead and then back alongside the cockpit one last time. Charlie Brown looked at him, still trying to make sense of what had happened. Blood covered his face. His eyes were wide with exhaustion and disbelief. He had expected death for hours. Now he did not know what to expect. Franz Stigler raised his hand to his forehead and held it there. A salute. Not as an enemy, not as a victor, but as one pilot to another. Then he banked his Messerschmitt to the left and peeled away, disappearing back toward the dark interior of Germany. Charlie Brown watched the German fighter grow smaller, then vanish into the clouds. Ahead of him lay the North Sea, 250 miles of freezing water. A bomber barely holding together, wounded men fighting to stay alive. Behind him, a German pilot was returning to a country that would never know what he had just done. One man was flying back toward danger and silence. The other was flying toward hope. And neither of them knew if they would survive what came next. When the German fighter disappeared behind him, Charlie Brown was alone again. Ahead lay 250 miles of the North Sea. Below, water so cold it could kill a man in minutes. Behind him, Germany and everything that could still end his life. The bomber was barely flying. 3 engines were damaged. One was unreliable. The hydraulic system was gone. The crew had no oxygen, no heat, and no working radio. 1 man was dead. 6 more were wounded. The morphine syringes in the medical kit were frozen solid. There would be no help. For nearly 2 hours, Brown flew west in silence, holding the aircraft just above stall speed, coaxing power from engines that wanted to quit. The airspeed hovered around 140 miles per hour. Any slower, and the bomber would fall into the sea. Any faster, and the weakened airframe might tear itself apart. Behind him, the crew fought to stay conscious, pressing frozen hands against wounds, trying to keep each other alive. At last, the English coast appeared through the gray haze. Brown had never seen anything more beautiful. The bomber was too damaged to reach its home base at RAF Kimbolton. Brown spotted RAF seething and lined up for an emergency landing. The landing gear extended only partially. The flaps responded just enough to matter. He brought the aircraft down in a controlled crash, metal screaming as the remaining gear collapsed, and the bomber skidded across the runway in a shower of sparks. When the aircraft finally stopped, Charlie Brown did not move. His hands were still locked on the controls. 8 men climbed out alive. 1 was carried out dead. Ye Old Pub would never fly again. At the debriefing, Brown told his intelligence officers everything. The German fighter, the escort, the salute. When he finished, they gave him an order. He was never to speak of it again. Sympathy for the enemy was dangerous. The story was classified. Brown obeyed. Across the ocean, Franz Stigler landed his Messerschmitt back in Germany. He told no one what he had done. If the truth came out, he could be court-martialed or executed. Silence was survival. So he kept the secret too. The war ended. Life moved on. Charlie Brown returned home, finished college, and rejoined the Air Force in 1949. He served in intelligence, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel before retiring in 1972. He settled in Florida and started a business. Franz Stigler survived the collapse of Germany, flew the revolutionary Me-262 jet in the final months of the war, then lost everything when the Luftwaffe ceased to exist. In 1953, he immigrated to Canada and rebuilt his life as a businessman in Vancouver. For decades, both men wondered. Brown wondered if the German pilot had survived the war. Stigler wondered if the bomber had made it across the sea. Neither could ask. Neither could speak. The secret lived quietly inside them for 46 years. In 1986, Charlie Brown was invited to speak at a military aviation event called the Gathering of Eagles at Maxwell Air Force Base. Someone asked if he had any memorable combat stories. For the first time, Brown broke his silence. He told the story. Something changed after that. Brown realized he needed answers. He began searching for the German pilot. He contacted military archives. No records. He wrote letters to historians. No replies. Years passed. Every lead went cold. In 1989, nearly out of options, Brown wrote one final letter. He sent it to a newsletter for former Luftwaffe pilots. He described the encounter and asked if anyone recognized it. Weeks later, a letter arrived from Canada. Inside were 3 words written in careful handwriting. I was the one. Franz Stigler had found him. Brown called the number listed in the letter. An old man with a German accent answered. There was a long silence. Then Stigler began to cry. They talked for hours. They discovered they had lived less than 200 miles apart for years without knowing it. That summer, they met in person in a hotel lobby in Florida. 2 former enemies stood facing each other, both carrying the weight of a decision made nearly half a century earlier. Then they embraced. A camera recorded 2 old men holding each other and weeping, not as soldiers, but as survivors. Stigler gave Brown a book. Inside, he wrote an inscription explaining that he had lost his only brother in 1940, and that on December 20th, 1943, he had been given a chance to save a B-17. He signed it with 2 words, your brother. They became family. They traveled together, spoke together, and met the surviving crew members of Ye Old Pub. Children and grandchildren stood before Stigler, living proof of what his decision had created. 25 people in one room who would never have existed if he had pulled the trigger. Recognition came late. In 2008, after decades of investigation, the United States Air Force officially confirmed the mission. Each surviving crew member received the Silver Star. Charlie Brown received the Air Force Cross, one of the highest awards for valor. Franz Stigler was later honored with the Star of Peace for his humanity in war. But medals were never the point. Franz Stigler died in March of 2008 at the age of 92. Charlie Brown followed 8 months later. They had lived long enough to know the truth. War had demanded hatred. Orders had demanded obedience. But in one moment, above the skies of Germany, a man chose something else. The war ended. The choice did not.